The royal guard stood immovable, a silent sentinel amidst the throng of tourists. His eyes scanned the crowd with practiced precision, ignoring the laughter and chatter that surrounded him. A tourist, unaware of the unspoken rules, made his move. With a grin, he sidestepped his friends and approached the guard, thinking it was all harmless fun. He stood a bit too close, elbowing his friend. "I bet he won't even flinch," he joked, nudging the guard lightly. His friends laughed, but the guard's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. He leaned in further, his phone raised for a selfie. Inches away from the guard's rigid form, the air shifted, growing heavier. The guard's posture tightened, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The tourist, still oblivious, ignored the subtle warning in the guard's demeanor. But something was different now. The calm that had once surrounded the guard seemed to have turned into a quiet threat. The tourist didn't notice. He was too busy posing, his laugh echoing around the plaza. The crowd watched, some sensing the tension. What would the royal guard do next? What would you do if you saw someone challenge authority like this? The royal guard stood proudly at the entrance of a grand palace, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of tourists. The historic monument behind him served as a symbol of tradition and power, and the guard's presence ensured that the respect due to such a sight was upheld. In this sacred space, the guard was more than just a figure. He was a protector of dignity and decorum, watching over the crowds with calm authority. The guard's stern expression revealed nothing, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning his surroundings. His posture was flawless, a testament to his years of training. He had mastered the art of remaining stoic, unmoved by distractions. His role was simple but profound, to uphold the integrity of the monarchy, ensuring that the peace and order of this royal site were never threatened. Today, however, his resolve would soon be tested. A tourist, casually dressed and smiling, wandered too close to the guard. Unaware of the gravity of the situation, he thought it was all in good fun, daring to joke and laugh as he approached the imposing figure. His carefree attitude made him unaware of the responsibility the guard carried, and soon he would realize how serious the consequences could be. What do you think will happen when the guard faces disrespect like this? The tourist's grin widened as he stepped even closer, his foot brushing the polished boots of the royal guard. He had been joking with his friends for the past few minutes, making light of the solemnity around him. But now he felt emboldened. A thought sparked in his mind. What if he could get the guard to react? What if he could break that unflinching mask of discipline? He believed it was all a game, a harmless way to get a rise out of the ever-stern guard. "Hey, buddy," the tourist called out, his voice a little too loud for the solemnity of the surroundings. "I bet you can't even blink." His friends chuckled behind him, but the guard's gaze remained steady, unyielding. The royal guard stood motionless, unmoved by the joke. His eyes never wavered, his shoulders straight as he continued to watch. The crowd scanning for threats or disturbances. There was no sign of a reaction. To the tourist, this only added fuel to the fire of his amusement. The man stepped closer, almost toe-to-toe with the guard now. He could feel the tension in the air but didn't recognize it for what it truly was. He raised his phone and began to snap pictures, his camera clicking away as if the guard were just another object to capture in the background of his vacation. "Smile, big guy. You're in a tourist trap," he teased, nudging his elbow into the guard's side as if trying to provoke a response. There was no movement from the guard, not a single muscle twitched. The man continued, oblivious to the growing weight of the situation. He took another step forward, now standing directly beside the guard, practically leaning into him as he took another picture. Around them, the crowd went on with their own business. A few other tourists noticed the antics, some laughing quietly, others turning their heads in confusion, unsure if this was part of some act. But no one dared to interfere. The presence of the guard made it clear that something was amiss, but they didn't know how or when it would unfold. The tourist, on the other hand, was emboldened. He shifted his phone to take one more shot, raising his arm higher and blocking the guard's view. "Seriously, how do you stand there all day like that without cracking a smile?" he said, not even looking at the guard anymore. He felt like he was winning. It was just a harmless joke. What harm could there possibly be? But the guard's composure, cold as ice, was a different kind of strength. The guard had seen countless tourists like this before. He had faced mockery, jokes, and even subtle insults. He had been trained for this. His duty was clear: uphold the dignity of the monarchy and maintain the decorum of the historic space he protected. Despite the growing disrespect, he didn't flinch, not even once. His gaze, though unwavering, began to narrow slightly, but the shift was almost imperceptible. It was as if the guard was marking the tourist's every movement, silently warning him without a word. There was power in that silence, an authority that radiated from the guard's unmoving figure. The tourist, however, took the lack of response as an invitation to continue. He smiled smugly as he snapped a final picture, almost pressing his phone up against the guard's face as if daring him to show any sign of life. "Come on, man, lighten up," he said, laughter bubbling up between words. "It's just a joke." A few more tourists started to watch, sensing the awkwardness of the moment, but not fully understanding what was at stake. Some whispered amongst themselves, exchanging confused glances, unsure if the guard's unflinching behavior was part of the performance or if something more serious was at play. The guard's eyes moved, just a fraction, not in response to the tourist's words, but in a shift of focus. He scanned the area, noting the presence of the group, the crowd's scattered attention. He understood the importance of maintaining control, not just over the situation, but over the impression that was forming in the minds of the audience. The tourist, still unaware of the escalating tension, took one final step forward. He now stood nearly face to face with the guard. His voice dropped slightly, still full of mockery but tinged with an edge of impatience. "You know, I'm beginning to think you've never smiled in your life, huh?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment the crowd seemed to quiet, waiting to see how the guard would respond. Still, the guard did nothing. His eyes remained locked forward, his face as unreadable as ever. But beneath the surface there was a stirring, a deep, simmering sense of restraint that the tourist hadn't yet touched, but had undeniably provoked. The power of his silence was more than just a lack of response. It was a testament to his training, his duty, and the intense focus it took to remain composed. The crowd, once oblivious, could now feel the shift. Whispers began to spread. A tension hung in the air, thickening as the moment stretched on. Would the guard remain stoic, or would he finally respond to the provocation? The tourist's actions, though seemingly innocent, had now pushed the boundaries. What started as a playful jest was becoming a direct challenge to the authority the royal guard embodied. And as the tourist laughed, oblivious to the cost of his words, the guard's stillness only grew more menacing. The royal guard stood like a statue, every muscle locked in place, his face a mask of stoic calm. His eyes, sharp and vigilant, followed the tourist's every movement, noting each gesture, each word that dared to cross the line. The atmosphere around him buzzed with an undercurrent of discomfort, but he remained immovable. The tourist, growing bolder by the second, had moved even closer, almost invading the guard's personal space. With each taunt and laugh, the guard's internal struggle deepened. His training demanded nothing less than absolute control over his emotions, over his reactions. His duty was not to show anger or frustration, but to embody authority and decorum. Even now, as the tourist pushed his boundaries further, the guard's exterior did not waver. There was no flinch, no hesitation. He was the epitome of composure, but beneath the surface a storm was brewing. It was subtle, a tightening in his chest, as the mocking words continued to fill the air, an almost imperceptible clench of his jaw as the tourist closed the gap between them. The tourist's behavior was a direct challenge to everything the guard stood for: respect, dignity, and tradition. It was as if the weight of the centuries of history he represented had been dismissed, reduced to nothing more than a source of amusement for a stranger who did not understand the responsibility he carried. The crowd had started to murmur. Some still smiled, not fully grasping the tension building. But the guard knew better. He knew the tourists were watching, not just the man who had dared to taunt him, but everyone else. His actions, his restraint, would set the tone. They would either see him as a joke or as someone worthy of respect. That realization only added to the pressure. The man leaned in even closer, his phone raised like a weapon pointing directly at the guard's face. "You're a real professional, huh? Not even a wink for the camera?" His voice was laced with mockery, but there was something more, something that tugged at the guard's resolve. A challenge had been issued not just to him but to the very essence of his duty. The tourist's voice rang out in the stillness, careless, but the guard remained unmoved. Though the weight of his silence pressed heavily upon him, there was no room for emotion. Not here, not now. The guard had been trained for moments like this, trained to endure disrespect and ridicule without a flicker of response. He had faced jeers from those who saw him only as an object for their amusement. He had endured the questions and the teasing of tourists, each one testing his patience. But the one thing that had never changed was his commitment to his duty. It wasn't just about standing there, unyielding in body. It was about standing firm in his mind, in his heart. He was a guardian of something much larger than himself, something that demanded the utmost respect. As the man continued to push, the guard's mind began to center. He focused on the present moment, on the weight of his posture, and the purpose that stood behind it. It was easy to be angry, easy to lash out, but he knew better. Anger would not earn respect. Silence would. Silence had power. He had learned that the hard way. The tourist continued his antics, oblivious to the internal war raging within the guard. The royal guard's face betrayed nothing. He had become the embodiment of control. His eyes, sharp and unfaltering, remained fixed on the horizon, watching as the tourist's arrogance grew, his gestures more exaggerated. But the guard's strength was not in his ability to endure, but in his refusal to break. It was a test, not just of his patience, but of his purpose. And every passing second that the tourist continued to taunt him, every word that threatened to weaken his resolve, only reinforced his commitment to remain firm. The guard was no stranger to moments like this. He had trained for them, endured them, and in many ways thrived on them. His body was weary, but his mind was sharp. He was a part of something much bigger than the discomfort of this moment. His actions would speak louder than any joke or taunt. His silence was not submission. It was a declaration of strength, of self-control. As the tourist stood there mocking him for the final time, the guard's stance only grew more rigid. This moment would pass, but the lesson it imparted would last longer than any words could express. His composure was not a weakness. It was the strength to stand firm, no matter how small the challenge seemed. The guard knew that the real test was not in the tourist's actions, it was in how he responded. And for now, his response was simple. He would remain steadfast, unyielding, and above all respectful of the duty he had sworn to uphold. The tourist, growing more emboldened with each second, leaned in even closer to the royal guard. He was no longer just a figure in the crowd, watching from the sidelines. Now he was almost face to face with the guard, and his audacity seemed to have no limits. He raised his phone again, this time tilting it at an angle to snap a picture from an even closer distance. The lens was almost inches away from the guard's stiff face, the lens focusing on the silent figure in a mocking display of invulnerability. "Seriously, are you ever going to crack a smile?" The tourist's voice was louder now, almost daring the guard to react. His friends behind him giggled, the energy in the air turning almost electric. The crowd, which had previously been a mix of unaware chatter, now fell silent. There was a growing sense that something more serious was happening, though no one knew how far this would go. The tourists around them glanced from one to another, unsure if this was part of the performance or a breakdown of protocol. They watched, waiting for a reaction, but still the royal guard remained firm, not a twitch of his expression, not even a flicker of emotion in his eyes. His duty, his unwavering composure, was all he could focus on. But the tourist, now intoxicated by the attention, grew more daring. He took another step forward, nearly standing toe-to-toe with the guard. Without thinking, he reached out, lightly tugging at the guard's uniform as though it were a simple joke. The tension in the air thickened, a ripple of disbelief sweeping through the bystanders as the guard's silence hung like a heavy weight. The tourist's fingers brushed against the crisp red and black fabric of the guard's ceremonial uniform. His grip tightened for a moment, pulling it just enough to provoke a reaction, just enough to see if the guard would finally snap. "What are you going to do now, huh?" he muttered with a sneer, still holding the fabric. "You can't just stand there forever. I'm sure you're just waiting for your break, right? Maybe you can go grab a coffee or something?" His voice was dripping with sarcasm, completely oblivious to the magnitude of his actions. The crowd had now grown uneasy. They could see the royal guard's physical restraint, his face still locked in that iron mask of composure, but they could also feel the tension, the faint signs of strain in his posture, the tightening of his fingers around his weapon that no one dared to acknowledge. They were watching something dangerous, unfold, but no one had the courage to step in. They were all just waiting for the storm to break. The tourist didn't stop. He pulled at the uniform once more, this time harder, as if daring the guard to stop him. "What? No response? Not even a glance? Come on, you've got to be bored out of your mind. Give us a show, will you? Show us you're human." With every word, the tourist's voice grew louder, more confident, as though he were forcing the guard into submission. He believed his mockery was powerful, that his words could break the royal guard's stoic exterior. What he didn't see was that with each disrespectful step, he was only pushing the guard's patience closer to its breaking point. The surrounding crowd shifted uncomfortably, some muttering among themselves, others too stunned to speak. Some were beginning to sense that this wasn't just a playful joke anymore. The way the guard stood, rigid, unyielding, almost as if anchored to the earth, told a different story. The guard's internal struggle intensified. Each taunt, each touch of his uniform was a small insult to his duty, to the position he represented. But there was no room for anger. There was no room for retaliation. His role, his solemn duty, demanded that he remain silent, unwavering, regardless of the disrespect being thrown his way. The tourist, however, had crossed a line. He didn't just mock the guard's presence anymore. He was taunting his very identity, his role, and the respect the royal guard embodied. And with each word, each movement that pushed the boundary of respect, the tension in the air thickened, building up to an almost unbearable level. The tourist was no longer just playing a game. He was testing the guard's authority, challenging it openly, and the consequences of this challenge were beginning to settle over the guard's mind. With a final glance at the crowd, the guard's posture remained as firm as ever. But in his chest, a wave of frustration, of an ever-growing resolve, began to form. His silence was not a sign of submission. It was the calm before a storm that was just about to break. And the tourist? He was only digging himself deeper into a hole he didn't yet understand. As the tourist's antics continued, the atmosphere around them began to change. What had started as a light-hearted scene quickly grew heavy, the laughter of a few fading as the crowd started to sense the subtle shift in the royal guard's demeanor. The murmurs began quietly at first. One by one, tourists who had been blissfully snapping photos and posing with the guard grew more cautious. They looked from the tourist to the royal guard, trying to gauge what was happening. The guard's unbroken composure had always seemed part of the act, something they had come to expect. But now, there was something different in the air, a palpable tension that no one could ignore. The group surrounding the tourist had quieted, their laughter now a distant memory. A few tourists exchanged nervous glances, their eyes flicking between the guard and the man who continued to test him. Whispers of unease began to circulate. "Isn't he supposed to stop that?" One person whispered to a companion, her voice barely audible. Another added, "This doesn't feel right." For a moment, the royal guard seemed more like a figure in a display than a living, breathing person. But the more the tourist pushed, the more the guard's presence seemed to swell, not physically, but in the way it commanded the attention of everyone in the crowd. The tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Some onlookers seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to intervene or just wait it out. Their hesitation only fueled the growing discomfort. They could sense that this wasn't a typical tourist encounter. The royal guard had remained unmoved thus far, but the question lingered in the air. How long would that remain the case? The mood shifted from casual amusement to nervous anticipation. No one spoke too loudly now. The once bustling plaza had grown quieter, as if the entire space held its breath, awaiting something to break the silence. Eyes were fixed on the royal guard, searching for the slightest flicker of emotion, the smallest sign of a reaction, but the guard's unwavering stillness only added to the mounting suspense. It was clear to the crowd that something was on the verge of happening, something no one had expected. The question was no longer if the guard would react, but when, and how. The once jovial atmosphere had been replaced with an uneasy anticipation, as everyone present began to realize the gravity of the situation. They were witnessing something larger than a simple tourist misstep. They were witnessing the silent weight of authority, and they had no idea how the moment would unfold. The guard remained motionless, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Every passing second seemed to stretch, the suspense hanging in the balance as the crowd waited for the next move. The shift in energy was palpable now, an emotional pivot that none of them could ignore. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet whispers of the crowd had died down to nothing. The only sound was the faint rustling of the guard's uniform as he stood motionless, unwavering under the tourists' relentless mocking. The man had taken another bold step forward, this time placing his hand on the guard's uniform as if to show ownership. A smug grin spread across his face as he leaned in, completely unaware of how close he was to crossing an irreversible line. The royal guard's eyes, until now calm and emotionless, flickered for the first time, narrowing ever so slightly. The tourists around them had fallen completely silent, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the world had slowed down. The guard's immovable stature had already spoken volumes, but now there was a change. The tension was unbearable, as if the weight of centuries of duty and discipline were about to fall upon the tourist in the form of a single moment. Finally, the silence was broken, but not by the loud command or aggressive action that some had expected. The guard's voice, low and measured, cut through the stillness. "Step back," he said, his tone firm, almost too calm, too controlled. "One more step, and there will be consequences." The words hung in the air like an iron chain, heavy, with authority. The crowd could feel it, the quiet warning that had the weight of law behind it. It was the kind of command that left no room for doubt, no room for error. But the tourist, still grinning, did not fully register the gravity of the situation. He hesitated for just a moment, his eyes narrowing as if questioning whether the guard would truly follow through. His arrogance, his belief that the guard would not react, blinded him to the seriousness of the warning. For a brief second the tourist seemed to waver, his hand still lightly grasping the edge of the guard's uniform. The air around them was charged with anticipation. The moment had come to a breaking point. The guard's calm, unyielding presence had set the tone. This was no longer just a game. But the tourist, his confidence unshaken, laughed it off. "Come on, man. What are you going to do? You're just standing there," he said, his words dripping with mockery. The crowd shifted uneasily again, unsure of what would happen next. The guard had spoken, and yet the tourist had not backed off. The moment of truth was coming, and it was clear now, this confrontation was inevitable. "Do you think the guard's patience will last much longer? What would you do if you were in their shoes?" The royal guard's warning hung in the air, its weight not just felt by the tourist, but by the entire crowd that had gathered around them. The tension was so thick it seemed to freeze time itself, but the tourist, still wearing his arrogant smile, failed to understand the gravity of what had just been said. He looked down at the guard's unmoving figure and laughed dismissively, clearly believing that nothing would happen. "One more step," the guard had said, but in the tourist's mind that was just another part of the show. He had pushed so far already without consequence. Why stop now? He was too caught up in his own amusement to recognize that his joke had turned into something much more dangerous. He had no idea that with one final move he would push the situation beyond repair. The crowd had gone quiet, every eye fixed on the two figures in the middle of the square. Some people in the crowd exchanged nervous glances, waiting for the guard to act, but others still looked on with confusion, unable to grasp the seriousness of what was unfolding before them. Then, without warning, the tourist made his move. In an impulsive gesture, he reached up toward the royal guard's tall black hat, grabbing the rim and yanking it forward. The disrespect was now so blatant, so flagrant, that there was no room left for misunderstanding. The hat was the symbol of the guard's authority, and by pulling it, the tourist was not just mocking the guard's posture or stance. He was trying to strip away everything the royal guard represented. The moment the tourist's fingers made contact with the hat, the royal guard reacted. In a split second, the guard stepped forward with the kind of speed and precision that stunned everyone watching. His hand shot out, faster than the tourist could blink, and in one swift motion he gripped the man's wrist with an unrelenting hold. The tourist's face instantly morphed from a smug grin to one of surprise and disbelief. He had underestimated the power of the guard's authority. The guard's voice, previously calm and measured, now rang out with undeniable authority. "Release it," he commanded, his tone cold, but the power behind the words could not be ignored. The tourist stumbled back, his heart racing as the shock of the guard's reaction set in. He had expected a playful rebuke or maybe a gentle nudge to back off, but not this. The force in the guard's grip was like nothing he had anticipated. He tried to yank his arm free, but the guard's hold was unyielding. For the first time, the tourist felt something he had never expected. A rush of fear mingled with the sudden realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. The playfulness had drained from his expression, replaced by a flicker of regret. He was trapped in his own miscalculation, unable to pull away from the iron-like grip of the royal guard. The crowd, which had been silently watching, now gasped in unison. Some took a step back, others edged forward, drawn to the spectacle unfolding before them. The royal guard had responded with the full force of his authority, and the shock waves rippled through the group. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was deafening. The guard's stance, strong and commanding, was all that could be seen. There was no amusement left in this interaction. No more jokes. Only the realization that the tourist's actions had led them both to this inevitable point. The tourist, still trying to break free, looked up into the guard's eyes, but he saw no anger there, only cold professionalism. There was no rage in the guard's gaze, no need to show anger. The authority he carried didn't need to be displayed with raised voices or threats. It was in the unspoken strength of his grip, in the control he held over the situation, that true power was evident. The tourist's breath caught in his throat as he realized the consequences of his behavior. The mocking had stopped, and the respect he had so easily dismissed now hung heavily in the air. And it was clear to everyone watching. This was no longer a moment of fun. It was the breaking point. The moment the royal guard's hand clamped down on the tourist's wrist, the energy in the crowd shifted. The laughter stopped. The whispers ceased. For a brief, almost surreal moment, everything around them seemed to fall silent, as if the entire plaza was holding its breath. The tourist struggled against the guard's unyielding grip, his face turning red with frustration and panic. His other hand darted toward the guard's arm, trying to free himself, but it was futile. The guard's posture remained unshaken, his expression still cold, his gaze unwavering. The strength in the guard's grip was unmistakable, and it made the tourist's attempts to break free seem almost pitiful. The crowd, which had once been unaware of the rising tension, now stood motionless, watching as the situation unfolded before them. Eyes wide, some of the onlookers exchanged nervous glances, while others looked on with a mix of disbelief and intrigue. There was no mistaking it now. The tourist had gone too far. In one smooth motion, the guard took a step forward, tightening his grip on the tourist's wrist. "Enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. The tone was so powerful, so final, that it silenced the tourist instantly. The man, once so full of bravado and arrogance, now stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as though words failed him. The crowd gasped, the tension in the air palpable. The tourist was caught, his defiance crumbling under the weight of the guard's authority. He had pushed and mocked and tested, but now he was facing the full brunt of the consequences of his actions. No more jokes, no more arrogance. He was powerless, reduced to silence by the sheer force of the royal guard's presence. The moment was intense, charged with a heavy silence that spoke volumes. The guard's calm but firm control had taken the situation completely out of the tourist's hands. The crowd, witnessing the consequences of challenging authority, couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a reprimand, it was a lesson in respect, in power, and in the cost of overstepping boundaries. For the tourist, the realization hit harder than any physical confrontation could. His chest tightened as he understood the gravity of what had just happened. He had tested the guard's patience, pushed him too far, and now the full weight of his mistake was before him, leaving him speechless, caught in the consequences of his actions. For a moment, the tourist stood completely still, his wrist trapped in the vice-like grip of the royal guard. His breath came in shallow gasps, a sharp contrast to the confident, carefree demeanor he had shown just moments earlier. The arrogance that had once fueled his every action was quickly evaporating, replaced by a sinking feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. His attempt to break free was futile. The guard's grip was firm, unwavering, and it reminded him of the vast power he had been foolish enough to provoke. He looked up into the guard's eyes that had been so still and unflinching. For the first time, the tourist saw the weight of the guard's role, the silent strength that had been present all along. The royal guard had never wavered, never blinked, but now the man saw the full force of the authority standing before him. What had seemed like a harmless joke only minutes ago now felt like a dangerous miscalculation. The tourist opened his mouth to say something, but the words were lost. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled cough. The crowd around them remained silent, the stillness hanging in the air like a heavy fog. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, the growing realization that he was the one who had crossed the line, and it was too late to take it back. His face flushed with a deep, burning humiliation. The guard's grip was unwavering, and there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. He had mocked the guard, taunted him, and now the weight of his disrespect was staring him in the face. He had underestimated the situation, and now, in the face of the royal guard's stoic presence, his bravado had completely faltered. He stood there, caught between the realization of what he had done and the embarrassment of being publicly humiliated. The laughter that had once filled the air seemed like a distant memory. Now it was replaced by a sense of shame so profound that it felt like the entire crowd was watching him sink deeper into his mistake. The guard, ever the embodiment of calm authority, stood unmoved. The tourist's defiance had crumbled, but there was no mercy to be found in the guard's silence. It was clear now that his actions had consequences, and there was no way to undo the damage. The realization struck harder than any punishment could. The tourist was caught in his own arrogance, and in the face of the royal guard's unyielding strength, he understood, too late, the true cost of his disrespect. The crowd remained still, every eye locked on the royal guard. As the tourist stood, silently, his face flushed with shame and his wrists still held firmly in the guard's unyielding grip. There was no sound now, no laughter, no whispers, just the tense silence that filled the air, broken only by the steady rhythm of the guard's calm breathing. The tourist, his bravado completely shattered, finally seemed to realize the full weight of the situation. But it wasn't just his realization that held the crowd's attention, it was the guard's presence. His unwavering composure, his silence, had become more powerful than any words could express. In that moment, the royal guard was not just an enforcer of duty. He was a living embodiment of authority, of respect, and of the duty he had sworn to uphold. The guard took a step back, releasing the tourist's wrist but maintaining his commanding stance. The movement was deliberate, calculated. He didn't need to say more, but as the tension stretched on, his voice broke the stillness, calm yet resolute, carrying across the entire crowd. "This is what happens when respect is lost," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a sword. His voice, firm and unwavering, left no room for argument, no space for doubt. Every syllable resonated with authority, carrying the weight of years of training, discipline, and responsibility. The crowd, once filled with unease, now stood in rapt attention, hanging on the guard's every word. The tourist, still struggling to find his voice, stood there, unable to respond. The crowd's eyes turned from him to the guard, and the lesson became clear. The Royal Guard's authority wasn't something to be mocked or tested. It was not a performance or a game. It was a symbol of the respect owed to the institution and to every individual who took on such a sacred duty. The tourist's behavior had crossed a line, but now in the face of justice there was no room for anything but accountability. The guard's eyes scanned the crowd, meeting the gaze of every onlooker, ensuring they understood the weight of his words. "Respect is not a privilege," he continued, his voice carrying the full gravity of his message. "It is earned, it is maintained, and when it is lost, consequences follow." For a brief moment, the guard held the crowd in his gaze, the silence now oppressive. The lesson had been taught. There was no need for further words, no need for a drawn-out explanation. The Royal Guard had shown them exactly what it meant to uphold authority, to stand firm in the face of disrespect, and to demand accountability. The tourist, now trembling, took a few steps back. The reality of his actions was sinking in, and for the first time he understood what it meant to challenge the authority of someone like the Royal Guard. His arrogance, his mockery, had led him here, to this public moment of reckoning. But the guard's authority was not in his physical strength alone. It was in his unspoken leadership, in his ability to command respect without raising a single hand. As the crowd stood still, absorbing the lesson, the tourist's humiliation deepened. The moment of action had passed, but the lesson would resonate long after. In a few short seconds, the Royal Guard had shown the crowd what respect truly meant, and what happened when it was taken for granted. The tourist stood there motionless, his face a deep shade of crimson as the gravity of the situation finally sank in. His breath came in shallow bursts, the earlier bravado now replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame. His arrogant smirk had long since disappeared, and in its place was a look of realization. A realization that his actions had led him to this moment, a moment that would follow him for a long time. The crowd watched in silence, many of them still processing the sudden turn of events. Some stood with their arms crossed, some shifted their weight from foot to foot, but all eyes were on the tourist. He had become the embodiment of the very lesson the Royal Guard had imparted, the consequences of disrespecting authority. The tourist tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He glanced around, looking for an escape from the intense scrutiny. His mouth opened and closed, but no apology came. The embarrassment was too much to bear. His friends, who had once encouraged his antics, now stood awkwardly at the edges of the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle unfolding before them. No one laughed now. No one mocked the guard. Instead, the tourist was the one who stood humiliated, his actions laid bare for all to see. The weight of the Royal Guard's authority bore down on him. What had seemed like a harmless joke moments ago had turned into a public display of recklessness. The crowd could feel it, the palpable tension, the full realization that this wasn't just a lesson for the tourist, but for everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. The guard's power had been evident, his resolve unshaken, and the tourist was now a symbol of the price one pays when they challenge that power. With one last defeated look at the guard, the tourist took a step back, his shoulders slumped in shame. He lowered his gaze, finally acknowledging the strength and authority of the Royal Guard. He had pushed too far, and now he was paying the price in front of an audience that would remember this moment for a long time. The crowd, once filled with the excitement of a joke, now felt the weight of his mistake. No more words were needed, the consequences were clear, and the lesson had been learned. Was the guard too harsh, or did they act justly? Would you have done the same thing? The silence that followed the royal guard's authoritative words was deafening. The crowd stood frozen, as though collectively holding its breath, waiting for the next step. The tourist's face was still, flushed with embarrassment, his eyes darting between the royal guard and the crowd, unable to escape the judgment that surrounded him. His attempts to speak, to apologize, were swallowed by the weight of his actions. Every inch of pride he once held had evaporated, leaving him exposed and humiliated. A figure from the crowd, one of the local authorities, stepped forward. The man's uniform was sharp, his posture as rigid as the royal guard's, and his gaze was firm as he approached the tourist. Without a word, he motioned for the tourist to follow. The tourist hesitated for a moment, his legs shaky as he stood there. The full weight of the moment settling on him, he knew what was coming. He had pushed too far, and now the consequences were unavoidable. The crowd watched as the authority figure gently but firmly guided the tourist away from the center of the plaza, his steps slow and deliberate. The tourist's head hung low, his gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His once confident, carefree demeanor was nowhere to be found. The arrogance that had driven him to mock the royal guard had been replaced by a deep sense of regret, a sinking feeling that only grew with each step he took toward the edge of the crowd. The royal guard stood tall, unwavering, his posture as perfect as ever. His eyes remained fixed forward, his focus never faltering. He had done his duty, and now he stood as the silent enforcer of respect and order. He did not look toward the tourist as he was escorted away. There was no satisfaction, in the guard's expression no gleam of triumph. This was not about victory. It was about maintaining the dignity of the institution he represented. His actions had been swift, but they were not born of malice. They were born of duty. The crowd remained eerily quiet, some still processing the dramatic turn of events. A few whispered amongst themselves, but the air was thick with the realization that what had just transpired was more than a public spectacle. It was a lesson. A reminder that authority, when disrespected, has consequences that are swift, clear, and unforgiving. The tourist was now a public example, a cautionary tale for those who might consider testing the limits of authority. As he was escorted from the plaza, his face red with shame, there was no laughter, no applause, only silence. The lesson had been learned, and the weight of it hung heavily over the crowd. They had all witnessed something rare, a public reckoning for a moment of disrespect, and in the quiet that followed, the full force of the royal guard's authority was made undeniably clear. The tourist, humiliated and defeated, had no choice but to follow the authority figures, his head down and his shoulders slumped. He had gone too far, and now he was paying the price. There was no turning back from this moment, no way to undo what had been done. His public embarrassment was the direct result of his own actions, and he would carry the weight of that for a long time. As he disappeared into the crowd, escorted out of the plaza, the royal guard's presence lingered. The crowd remained still, aware that they had witnessed not just a reprimand but the swift justice that followed a lapse in respect. It was a sobering moment, one that reinforced the lesson of the day, the importance of authority, of respect, and the consequences that come when those boundaries are crossed. As the tourist disappeared into the crowd, escorted away by the authority figures, the royal guard stood silently in the center of the plaza. His posture was as perfect as ever, unbroken, unyielding. The crowd began to disperse, some exchanging whispers, others still processing what they had just witnessed. But the guard remained fixed in place, his gaze distant, following the retreating figure of the tourist, whose humiliation was now evident in every step. In this moment of stillness, as the plaza began to return to its usual hum of activity, the guard felt a rare flicker of doubt, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel during the confrontation. He had done his duty, and he had done it well. His response had been swift and certain, as it always was. The tourist had crossed a line, and the guard had made sure there were consequences. He had upheld the authority of the monarchy, ensuring that respect for the royal guard and the institution he represented was never questioned. And yet, as the last echo of the tourist's footsteps faded, The guard's thoughts lingered. Could it have been different? Could a simple warning, a softer gesture have sufficed? His eyes, though still fixed forward, softened slightly as he considered the question. He had seen it all before. Tourists testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeking to provoke. His training had prepared him for such moments, but this one had felt different. The tourist had pushed so far, so blatantly, that a single warning had never seemed like enough. But now, in the aftermath, the guard wondered if there had been another way to handle it. A part of him wished the situation had been diffused with words rather than actions. Could he have made the point with just a look, a shift in posture, a reminder of the respect that was owed? Would that have been enough to send the message without the public display of force? His thoughts were fleeting, and the guard quickly reminded himself of his duty. His role wasn't about sentiment, it was about upholding tradition, maintaining order. His actions had been justified and the lesson had been delivered. But still, as the crowd thinned and the plaza returned to normal, the faintest trace of introspection lingered. Would the outcome have been the same if he had shown more restraint? The guard's internal struggle was subtle, but real. A moment of personal reflection in the midst of his otherwise unflinching resolve. The crowd stood frozen for a moment, still processing the events they had just witnessed. The atmosphere, once filled with excitement and laughter, had now shifted to a heavy silence. Some onlookers were the first to break the stillness, exchanging whispers among themselves, as if unsure of how to feel. The scene had unfolded so quickly, so dramatically, that the full weight of what had just transpired hadn't fully settled in. A few people, mostly those who had been closest to the confrontation, couldn't help but shake their heads, their faces painted with disbelief. "Did you see that? He really did it," one whispered to a companion. Others nodded, murmuring quietly in agreement. Their faces reflected a mixture of shock and understanding, as if they had witnessed something important but uncomfortable. They respected the guard's authority, yet couldn't ignore the discomfort of seeing a man publicly humiliated in such a manner. There was no question that the tourist had been wrong, but the public spectacle of it left some feeling uneasy. At the same time, there were those who stood a little straighter, nodding with approval at the guard's actions. "That's how it's done," one older woman muttered, her voice firm with conviction. She had seen enough disrespect in her time to know that the guard had acted appropriately. To her, the lesson was clear. The boundaries had been crossed and someone needed to enforce the rules. The tourist had not only disrespected the guard but also the traditions the guard upheld. The swift consequences were exactly what was needed. Among the younger tourists, there was a mix of reactions. Some felt sympathy for the man who had been humiliated. They couldn't help but empathize with the discomfort he must have felt as he was escorted away, his pride broken before the crowd. "It was just a joke," one young woman murmured to her friend. "I don't think it was that serious." But the seriousness of the situation was undeniable to others, especially those who had witnessed firsthand the guard's unwavering discipline. They understood that the guard's actions were not just about enforcing personal boundaries, they were about upholding a greater sense of respect for the institution he represented. As the crowd began to disperse, the reactions remained divided. Some spoke quietly, their heads shaking as they walked away, while others stood taller, their backs straighter as they walked with a new respect for the authority they had just witnessed. The divide in the crowd mirrored the complexity of the situation itself. Justice had been served, but it wasn't a simple victory for anyone. The royal guard had made his point clear, but in doing so, he had left the audience with a range of emotions to reflect on. Was the punishment too harsh? Did the tourist deserve to be humiliated publicly? The crowd was left to grapple with these questions, each person's interpretation of justice and authority different, but equally valid. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the plaza began to return to its usual rhythm, the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The tourist had been escorted away, his head down, his steps heavy with the burden of his actions. His once confident demeanor had been shattered, replaced by the quiet humility of a man who had learned a hard lesson in the most public of ways. The royal guard stood tall, his presence unshaken. The duty he had sworn to uphold had been carried out with unwavering precision, and as he watched the tourist fade into the distance, a faint sense of fulfillment washed over him. There was no joy in the outcome, no satisfaction in the humiliation of the man before him. His actions were not about punishment, they were about restoring respect. His silence had spoken louder than any words could, and now the lesson had been imparted. The plaza, once full of laughter and light-hearted moments, now carried a somber tone. The crowd had witnessed the consequences of challenging authority, and in that silence the moral of the story was clear. Actions, no matter how small, always have consequences. Respect was not something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, maintained, and upheld. In the Royal Guard's unwavering stance, the crowd had seen the embodiment of that truth. The tourist, as he was led away, now understood the cost of his disrespect. It was a lesson that would stay with him long after the embarrassment of the moment had faded. He had tested the limits of authority, and in doing so, he had pushed beyond what was acceptable. But the guard's response had reminded him and the crowd that authority, once challenged, must be respected, not just in the moment, but in the understanding of the weight it carries. The Royal Guard had done his duty, and the tourist had been given a lesson in humility, a lesson that only came from understanding the true cost of disrespect. The power of authority wasn't in the ability to punish, it was in the quiet strength to uphold boundaries and ensure that respect was maintained, even when it was tested. What lesson do you think the tourist learned today? Would you have acted differently? The story began with a playful tourist whose light-hearted gestures and mockery tested the Royal Guard's unyielding composure. Initially, the guard stood motionless, his discipline on full display, while the tourist pushed the boundaries of respect with jokes and exaggerated gestures. What started as a harmless prank quickly escalated, with the tourist ignoring the guard's clear warnings and crossing a line that should never have been tested. As the tourist's behavior grew bolder, the tension between the two escalated. The guard's patience was nearly exhausted, yet he maintained his professionalism, setting the stage for the inevitable confrontation. The tourist's attempt to touch the guard's uniform, pushing the limits of mockery, triggered the Royal Guard's swift and firm response. In an instant, the guard took control of the situation, gripping the tourist's wrist and delivering a powerful final warning. The crowd watched in stunned silence, understanding that this was not simply a reprimand, but a public lesson in respect. The tourist, now fully aware of his mistake, was publicly humiliated, escorted away by other authority figures. As he walked away, head hung low, the Royal Guard remained steadfast, knowing he had done his duty. The lesson was clear. Actions, no matter how small, have consequences, and respect for authority is essential in maintaining order and dignity. What do you think of the Royal Guard's actions in this story? Did the tourist deserve the consequences he faced, or was the guard too harsh? Imagine being in the tourist's shoes. Would you have tested the guard's patience, or would you have respected their authority from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you would have done if you were in this situation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear your opinions on the lesson of respect in this story, and if you've ever been in a similar situation where authority was tested. Your thoughts could be featured in our next video, so be sure to join the conversation and stay connected. We've got more shocking Royal Guard encounters coming your way next week. Get ready for more intense moments where authority and respect are put to the test, with unexpected consequences that will leave you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the next story, one where a seemingly innocent interaction takes a dramatic turn, showing the power of duty and the importance of honoring authority. Stay tuned for more powerful moments of justice, authority, and human connection. Until next time, remember, respect isn't just given, it's earned.